I'm gonna start. I'm Eileen Galuli. I'm the executive director for the Society of Fellows and Haven Center for the Humanities, and welcome you all for coming. And we're very pleased to have you. And but I also want to say that this is the fourth and final day of this event called Facts and Fears and Fake News. And for those of you who are attending the conference for the first time, let me say a few words about sessions 1 to 3. So session 1 started on Monday evening at the Trinity Long Room Hub at Trinity College Dublin with an event called Behind the Headlines, Freedom of Expression, in which we discussed the future of professional journalism and educating public opinion at a time when its obligation to challenge authority and power is increasingly under attack. You can listen to the podcast for this at the Trinity Long Room Hub website, and I think Jane Ohlmeyer knows the URL by heart. Yes, no?
No, I don't actually. If you Google it, podcast, it'll come up.
Okay, great. In which several people participated, including some folks from our campus and the editor of the Irish Independent, among others. Session 2 also occurred in Dublin on Tuesday, and it was the beginning of Factions, Fears, and Fake News, part 1. And there was a panel on the growth of right-wing nationalism and the collapse of the left, which was moderated by Fintan O'Toole, and which included among its panelists Jürgen Barkov, who will be moderating a session this afternoon. He's right there. Also, a panel on post-truth, which included, again among others, our own Joey Slaughter from the English department here at Columbia, and Todd Gitlin, who sociologist in the journalism school. Another panel was the third of that day, was called Migration and Crisis, and it discussed that topic from disciplinary perspectives: history, human rights, linguistics, and peace studies. And then last evening, we had session 3 on the Barnard College campus called Coming to Terms with a Polarized Society, Professional Journalism, Polarization, Post-Truth, Post-Trump, with Michael Schudson of the Columbia Journalism School and the former editors of the Washington Post, Len Downey, and the New York Times, Bill Keller. And session 4 is today, and it's on the program, so I won't go into it. This complicated, collaborative transatlantic conference is celebrating the inauguration of a partnership between the Society of Fellows and Haven Center for the Humanities at Columbia and the Trinity Long Room Hub and Arts and Humanities Research Institute. And that being quite a mouthful, we just refer to it as the Haven Hub Partnership. This partnership entails, so far, it's every time Jane and I talk, it somehow gets another component to it, but 2 to 3 events per year in Dublin or New York City of the sort that we're hosting today. Also, the Trinity Long Room Hub and Haven Center Visiting Fellows Program, which is a short-term residency program open to this side, tenured and tenure-track faculty who have a project that would benefit from interaction with folks at TCD and vice versa, the TC folks coming here. And it also includes a consortial project on cultural trauma and the crises of democracy, which along with the Trinity and Columbia members counts amongst its other members humanities centers at the universities in Delhi, Sao Paulo, Zagreb, and Budapest. So before I turn the proceedings over to Darryl Jones, who is the Dean of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science at Trinity College Dublin, and who will be moderating this first panel on the challenges of digital media, I want to thank some of the many people who have made this event happen. So thanks first of all to Jane Ohlmeyer, my partner at the counterpart at the Trinity Long Room Hub, whose idea this was, and thanks to her colleagues, particularly Jürgen Barkov and Darryl Jones, for their participation in Dublin and also in New York City. But perhaps most of all, before I forget, this is something that usually comes at the end of the day, but I seem to always forget to do it at the end of the day. I want to thank the wonderful and really wonderfully hardworking staff at the Society of Fellows and Haven Center for the Humanities, which includes Tess Drawman, our web and communications coordinator, Kay Joan, our program manager, and Emily Bloom, the associate director for the Society of Fellows and Haven Center, who know even better than I do that none of this could have come off without them. So, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for your introduction and for your very kind hospitality. My name is Darryl Jones, and I am the Dean of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Trinity College Dublin. And for myself and my colleagues, Jürgen Markov and Jane Allmeyer, we're very delighted to be here. And as Eileen said, this is part of an ongoing week-long symposium, starting on Monday and Tuesday in Dublin, flying transatlantic, and ending on Thursday and Friday here in Columbia. Those of you who remember the Live Aid concert of 1985, you might recall that Phil Collins flew from Dublin to Philadelphia to appear twice on the bill of the same event in the same day. We feel a little like that, a small, non-Concorde flying, non-rock star way. This event is, as Eileen said, part of a larger relationship which we are delighted about between the Haven Centre and the Marine Pub, and which is itself part of a larger relationship between Trinity College and Columbia University, which involves dual degree programs and the like. So this is very exciting and very important for us. I think there can be no more important subject for universities to discuss at the moment, with our commitment to intellectual inquiry, to the search for truth, than the contemporary phenomenon, or is it a contemporary phenomenon, of fake news. I think this is something which we in universities internationally are having to face up to. And how we respond to this will be a test of what our obligations are, what our responsibilities are to our societies and perhaps to the world. That sounds like a big deal, because I think it is a big deal. Our panel today is on the challenges of digital media. One of the things, thank you. One of the things that has struck me of late is that we may be completely psychologically unprepared for the vast and accelerated shifts in the nature of human interrelations that have been brought about in the last decade by the rise of the internet, and most recently of all by the appearance of social media. I fear that this may destroy us all if we're not very careful. I'm quite serious about this. So I think this is a very important, the challenges of digital media are real. This is a very important subject for us to begin with this morning. So to say a word or two about the way in which this first session will run, we have three speakers to begin with, who will each talk for about 15 minutes, is that right? 20 minutes. We'll each talk for about 20 minutes. Nothing can possibly go wrong. We'll each talk for about 20 minutes, and then, because it's a long session, we'll adjourn and have a cup of coffee. And then we have two more members of the panel who will be joining us for a conversation after that. And then in turn we will open the discussion to the floor. But I'll begin by introducing the speakers around me in the order that they're going to speak. So our first speaker is Andie Tucher, who is a historian and a former journalist. She's Professor of Journalism and Director of the Communications PhD program. And she's working on a history of fake news in the US for Columbia University Press. And plans to teach a seminar on the topic in the spring. Andie writes widely on the evolution of truth-telling, conventions in journalism, photography, and personal narrative, and other non-fiction forms. Our next speaker is Peter Koechley. And Peter is the co-founder of Upworthy, a media company on a mission to draw mass attention to the stories that matter most. Before Upworthy, he produced viral videos for the advocacy organisation MoveOn.org and served as managing editor of The Onion, America's finest news source. I second that emotion. And our last speaker is Joan Donovan. Joan is the Media Manipulation Research Lead at Data and Society Research Institute, where she researches how the internet became a political tool. She received a PhD in Sociology and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego, where she studied activist communication networks. After that, she went to UCLA for a postdoc at the Institute of Society and Genetics, where she studied white nationalists' use of science and DNA ancestry tests in the search for racial purity. So those are our speakers. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Andie Tucher, who's our first speaker.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm here a little bit under false pretenses because I'm going to talk about the challenges before digital media, but some of them will seem very recognizable to anyone who's been paying attention to elections or politics or fake news or new technologies or existential dread. On September 25th, 1690, the editor of the first newspaper ever published in what were then the British American colonies made a bold claim. Benjamin Harris announced that his paper, which he called Public Occurrences, was going to tell only the truth. It would use only the most trustworthy sources, it would correct its own mistakes, it would expose anyone else who told lies. Because, as it said, there are way too many false reports out there. And then the first American paper went on to print a whopper of a false report of its own. Harris reported that the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, was sleeping with his daughter-in-law. We know it was a fake because Louis XIV of France didn't have a daughter-in-law at the time. The wife of his only son had died many months before, at the age of 30, after spending most of her adult life confined to a sickbed. Plus, the king had long since given up his notoriously libertine ways when he married his devout second wife. And Harris, who was a well-connected printer in Amsterdam and London before coming to Boston, he would have known all of that. But he was also a fervent Protestant, and he knew that the powerful Catholic king was persecuting French Protestants. He saw Louis as an mortal enemy, and probably figured that his story with this little hint of incest would also sound just truthful enough about an absolute monarch who was also a papist. So more than 300 years before anyone ever questioned the involvement of Facebook or Twitter in tipping an American election, Harris was exploiting his self-proclaimed position as a truth teller to plant false information intended to undermine an opponent, a textbook example of fake news. But he paid for it. His press was immediately shut down. His paper was confiscated. The main problem wasn't even that the news about the king was fake. The bigger issue was that Harris had not first submitted his paper to the royal authorities for approval, which was legally required in 1690 before you could print anything. Since, of course, it's the prerogative of the king alone to have the final say about what is true and what is false. So in another familiar scenario, the promoter of a fake report was shouted down by someone who was making a weightier claim to be the keeper of what's true. In the current debates over fake news, the term covers an enormous amount of ground. It's applied to everything from the mischievous and the mistaken, through the opportunistic and the satirical, all the way to the deceitful and the subversive. But all those kinds of distortions and deceptions and more have deep roots in the American news landscape. Obviously, the political and media context of the 21st century is vastly different than that of 1690. But we will see some parallels and resonances as we go along, including a seminal turning point that came in the 1890s and the early 20th century during a debate over a journalistic practice that everyone, especially its many fans, were calling faking. I'll come back to that. Before the 20th century, U.S. newspapers served up what you might call a dog's breakfast. It was a messy and ill-defined and ever-changing jumble of fact, fiction, information, lies, propaganda, hoaxes, truth. Journalists and citizens alike acknowledged and valued the Enlightenment ideal that a well-conducted press was vital to the democratic process. They accepted the general idea that journalism ought to present a realistic picture of what was going on in the world. But at the same time, newspapers were also fulfilling a wide range of other roles, only some of which had anything to do with democracy or even reality. It wasn't that journalists were breaking rules, it's that there really weren't many rules at all. Objectivity, as we heard yesterday from my colleague Michael Schutzen, was not a value anyone cherished in the 19th century. It wasn't a value anyone had heard of. There was nothing like widely accepted journalistic norms about how to put together those realistic pictures. It was common and perfectly acceptable for a paper to be openly funded by a political party and to devote itself to news that reflected that party's ideology. Didn't bother anyone. The kind of journalist known as the reporter was still brand new, having been born in the 1830s as the necessary agent of the independent commercial press. So reporters and their subjects were figuring out the rules as they went along. There were no guidelines about undercover reporting, for instance, or source protection, or access to crime scenes or combat zones. There was no sense that the language of journalism was in any way distinctive or different from any other kind of language. There was no universal expectation that editors had any responsibility to tell their readers what was true and what wasn't. Many editors deployed the time-honored headline, "important if true," to express any number of subtle variations on the message, "well, we're not really sure." During the Civil War, for instance, the New York Herald attached that headline to an item about 3 Union ships that were abandoned in Charleston Harbor. The headline marked the item as a placeholder. They were staking a claim to a possible scoop, but preemptively disavowing any responsibility if it later proved wrong, which in this case it did. In smaller towns, printed matter could be very scarce, so newspaper editors stuffed their columns with everything readers could have gotten in a bookshop if they had such a thing. So there were nuggets of truthful intelligence nestled in the columns indiscriminately with poems and sermons and humorous sketches in regional dialect, old wives' remedies, serialized novels, travelers' letters, jokes, no physical differentiation, typographical, anything between them and news. So there emphatically was not a convention that every item in a newspaper needed to be true. Nor were readers necessarily either bothered or even surprised when they came across some that weren't. They understood that any encounter with a newspaper required them to monitor their expectations and adjust their assumptions about the authenticity of what they read. The choice to believe was theirs. Often journalistic work that looks to us like fake news didn't fool anybody. It was intended for entertainment or commercial purposes, or usually both. You could see that very clearly, for instance, in the new kind of newspaper established in the 1830s, the independent and entrepreneurial penny press, a commercial mass press intended to serve a new kind of audience. Not the political and financial elites who looked to their papers for partisan or business news. This was to give working class and middle class readers a press that felt like theirs, that was filled with timely information about their daily lives. And editors worked to inveigle these first-time readers and instill in them the newspaper habit by plying them with sensation, bluster, humbug, entertaining stories about hot air balloons that could cross the ocean, or huge telescopes that could see weird blue goats on the moon. And the point, though, was not to fool readers, but to assure them that they had the same rights and capabilities as any elite reader to read and evaluate the news for themselves. In the West, newspapers gloried in their reputation for rambunctiousness. They teased readers with tall tales about detached sunspots or petrified men frozen into weird positions. Many of us are familiar with Mark Twain's inability not to exaggerate the truth, but back in the day, his colleague Dan DeQuille was even more notorious, and his hoaxes, unlike most of Twain's, actually fooled people. Among DeQuille's surviving papers at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley are letters from famous Eastern scientists pleading for more information about the mountain alligators or the eyeless hot water fish and the fabulous Western creatures that DeQuille wrote about. And several of those letters carried DeQuille's own annotation chortling about having fooled that professor. Those were the fun ones. The others, not so much. No one was applying the term fake to journalism at this point. The word entirely was confined to the underworld or the theater or other loose precincts. But there were many instances of what we would now call faking that were intended for purposes that are rather more dubious. When new technologies came along, for instance, journalists and news consumers weren't always in agreement on how they related to reality. In the 1860s, a photographer named William Mumler began selling spirit photographs to bereaved buyers. He would take your portrait in the ordinary way, and when you looked at it, you would see a thin, ghostly image hovering over your shoulder, an image that he told you, and you really wanted to believe was the benevolent spirit of your dead son or mother or wife, made visible by the magical new process of photography that seemed to have a special connection with the uncanny. And in 1898, viewers flocked to Nickelodeons and theaters where Thomas Edison's magical new moving pictures brought the viewer straight into combat with the Cuban troops who, with the help of their friends in the U.S., were bravely battling for freedom against the corrupt and bestial Spanish invaders, like occupiers. But most viewers didn't know that motion picture cameras were so huge and clumsy they couldn't keep up with the action, or that those exciting shots of rebel Cuban troops shooting the lordly Spaniards off their horses were actually staged in the hills outside West Orange, New Jersey, and featured New Jersey National Guard troops dressed up in rakish costumes. And of course, Benjamin Harris's story about royal incest was certainly not the last or the only devious fake that was meant to undermine or seize political or social power. There was a piece of fake political news from 1844 was so notorious that its name survives to this day. If you look up Rohrback in a dictionary, you'll see it defined as something like a fictitious slander intended to smear a political figure. It derives from a gambit by a campaign paper supporting the Whig Henry Clay for president. Near the very end of the campaign, the paper ran an excerpt supposedly taken from a recent travel book by someone named Rohrback, described coming across a group of slaves who had been branded on the shoulder with the initials of Clay's Democratic opponent, James K. Polk. Even among voters who generally favored slavery, branding would have been seen as unacceptable, and the report was meant to show Polk as a man of low and vicious character. But the fake backfired when a Democratic paper refuted it with documentary evidence that the passage had been lifted by a real book by a real traveler whose name was not Rohrback, and the stuff about Polk had been added. The pressures of wartime often distort reporting, and the fratricidal Civil War offered unprecedented opportunities for propaganda. The Southerner Mary Chesnut complained bitterly in her diary about reports in the Yankee press that Confederates were abusing their Yankee prisoners in savage ways. But at least she had the rare presence of mind to wonder whether the similar stories the Southern press was telling about how Yankees were abusing their Confederate prisoners were equally fantastic. So by the end of the 19th century, Americans were deeply experienced in the art of evaluating journalistic work for truthfulness. They expected any encounter with journalism might well require them to evaluate it. And it's in this era, in the last decades of the 19th century, we finally see our quarry, the fake, explicitly so called. Reporters for the increasingly popular sensational papers, coming to be called the yellow press, were starting to openly discuss a practice they called faking, a practice they liked and they valued, and they insisted their readers did too. What most of them meant by faking was not something nefarious or deceptive, but simply the art of making artful and harmless tweaks, filling in missing details or adding colorful embellishments. Their stated purpose was not to deceive, but to give readers what they wanted, something more colorful and interesting than they could get from what one dismissively called a bare recital of facts. Or as another reporter cheerfully put it in a trade journal, faking was not exactly lying. So there we have a journalist acknowledging to other journalists that the purpose of journalism is to get somewhere close to the truth, but not really too close. But at this point at the end of the 19th century, not exactly lying almost seemed like business as usual, given these Wild West traditions of American journalism. Politics could be fratricidal, open partisanship was normal, the rules of the craft were flexible, technology did magical things, entertainment was more valuable than information, everyone could be a pundit about the news. Does any of this sound familiar? By the end of the 19th century, though, many readers and journalists alike were being increasingly dissatisfied with the state of American journalism. repelled by its garishness and untrustworthiness, troubled by its failure to do the work of democracy. Some journalists, chief among them Adolf Oakes and his New York Times, were finding inspiration and profitability in a new social and intellectual stance. They're intrigued by the straightforward, almost scientific cultural outlook known as realism. It's percolating through literature, art, photography, and by emerging modes of scientific inquiry that were based on reason, systematic observation, careful neutrality. Journalism joined other disciplines like medicine and law in what was becoming an effort to identify and organize and control the distinctive bodies of knowledge and codes of behavior that set them apart as professionals. For journalists, that meant taming their unruly craft with rules and standards and ethical conventions. It meant adopting particular standardized modes of fact-based inquiry. It meant developing a particular discursive style for journalism, a plain, neutral style focusing on the clear presentation of facts. And it meant launching a battle against that whole tradition of hoaxing, teasing, lying, exaggerating, shading the truth. All of those practices that the critics summed up in that one word so beloved by their disreputable colleagues, faking. And they used their united and explicit condemnation of faking to claim for themselves the moral and professional high ground as the only journalists who could be trusted to tell the truth. Truth-telling, they claimed, was a unique and special province of the journalist, one that ordinary people did not have the methods and the language and the tools to handle themselves. So it's a crucial turning point in the evolution of journalism, the moment when credibility and authority were erected as the hallmarks of the mainstream press, and readers were relieved of the responsibility, or maybe the opportunity, of adjudicating matters of fact. No longer were they supposed to decide for themselves what to believe. Of course, the turn toward professionalism did not stop individual reporters from willfully or stupidly faking work, but it did mean, for instance, that in 1892, when Henry Trickey of the Boston Globe got it all terribly wrong and reported that the reason Lizzie Borden murdered her father with an axe was that he had found out she was pregnant with her uncle's child, the Globe came out the next day and owned up, working to assert its own credibility by acknowledging and correcting its fabrications, embracing the obligation to police its own boundaries. So this great effort by the serious press to get rid of fake news by establishing rules was a fine idea. I think it was a noble idea. Joseph Pulitzer's son Ralph told the very first class of students at the journalism school his father had founded that any time a newspaper prints a fake, it becomes a degenerate and perverted monstrosity. You, he told the students, you are among the best remedies I know against faking, because you will be trained to regard newspaper work as not a trade, but a solemn trust. But you don't need me to tell you what happened next, because a profession that roots its claims to authority in its special relationship with the true inevitably will produce stories that aren't. And some of them have caused real harm. Walter Duranty, who whitewashed the deadly consequences of Stalin's collectivization project. Judith Miller, diligently reporting the existence of non-existent WMDs. Rolling Stone, misreporting a story about a rape. And you don't need me to tell you about the many other challenges, some of them closely related, that are also facing the profession. Citizens resist the very idea that special journalistic methods of truth-telling are all that special or all that truthful. People insist they're perfectly happy to accept the responsibility of deciding truth for themselves. Citizens reject the authority of a whole range of institutions, not just the press, but the government, the university, the church. Citizens face limitless choices of where to get their information, so if they don't like what they get in one place, they can go somewhere else that may have different rules or no rules at all. As news organizations struggle with the vast economic changes brought about by new media, and I could go on and on. Now, as a historian, I don't have to solve problems, I just get to explore them and analyze them, right? So I'll end by saying the only effort I know of that completely and successfully shut down fake news came back in 1690, when the Royal Councillors of Massachusetts Bay stopped Benjamin Harris from producing his paper after he printed his incest story. For 14 years after that, there was not a single item of fake news published in an American newspaper, because for 14 years after that, there was not a single newspaper published in America.
Thank you very much, Andie. Over to you.
That was excellent.
Peter, do you want to take the
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a couple different things. But in general, I feel like with news under assault as it is today, there is a tendency to glorify news and to say that news has no problems and we need to circle the wagons around to defend it. And I want to step back from that and say, even as news is under assault, news has some real problems that I think are worth addressing. So I want to address them through the lens of fake news. So the first thing I want to do is mount a defense of fakeness, which Andie set up nicely. And fake news became a big topic in this last election. I started thinking about it a while before that. In 10th grade, I started a newspaper called The Yellow Press. That was, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, where The Onion is from, and so sort of satirical news was in the water. And if you were a young person and wanted to do something interesting and couldn't keep a beat or carry a tune, started an independent newspaper. So mine was The Yellow Press. Later I went on to The Onion, where I was a freelancer and eventually managing editor. And when I was at The Onion, we would take it as a badge of honor when someone would read our fake news and believe that it was real. The first example that I remember was the article, "Congress threatens to leave D.C. unless new Capitol is built." This is sort of being a sports team, they wanted a retractable dome. And the state newspaper of China reprinted the article as real news. And then the next day when it came out, they realized that they were wrong. They issued the most defensive and terse statement, which said, apparently in America there are companies that are paid to tell lies. And then we also, one type of satire we would do one sort of category of article would be taking the sort of stereotypical mythic impressions and misimpressions and fever dreams of people on different sides of the political spectrum and reporting them as news. So one of those was 1998 homosexual recruitment drive nearing goal, which got passed around on tons of right-wing forums and religious forums saying, like, see, the gays do have this whole agenda. It's right here in the newspaper. Another one was Planned Parenthood opens $8 billion abortion plex, which a congressman, I believe, cited on the House floor. But back then it was sort of fun, because when people got it wrong and then realized that it was an Onion story, they would be embarrassed and they would be ashamed. They would feel like the joke was on them. I feel like if we had run the abortion plex story in 2016, people would have doubled down. Like Alex Jones would have said he had seen the plans for the abortion plex. Like it would have, like, the idea that you would be ashamed of that sort of went out the window. It felt like the year that shame died. So I do think sort of the idea of telling things that aren't true in order to get at the truth is a really important practice. I think I want to stand up for the role of satire, I want to stand up for the role of all fiction in novels and film as a way to get at truths that, I like that phrase, the bare recital of facts, that the bare recital of facts really actually doesn't allow you to get to. I wrote a piece for The Onion in the mid-2000s that was Secretary of Defense humiliated as U.S. credit card rejected. And it was a great, like, we photoshopped a great Donald Rumsfeld, very sheepish. And, you know, there were lots of news articles about, you know, the untenability of our foreign adventures in war and the economic instability and the deficit spending and all those things. I think our story got to the truth of those quicker, and I'm ruining humor by talking about it, but got to the heart of it a little better. I wrote an article also that was Google announces plans to destroy all information it can't index, which was sort of like 10 years before the backlash against Google and Facebook. I think that it's useful. I think that when there's a real problem with news in that the sort of objective strictures that journalists put on themselves are very good for getting to a shared understanding of reality and truth. They're very bad for telling stories, and people react to stories, people connect to stories, and So there's a sense when you're reading news that I'm not being told the whole story. I'm certainly not being told it in a way that is engaging or interesting 90% of the time. And I have the option to read stories that are written well and excitingly and engagingly and entertainingly that also give me things that feel like information. So I'm going to read those instead. I think that can obviously be used for good and ill, and has been used a lot for both, but sort of in this moment of fake news for, I sort of don't want to lose the value of fake news. So that's point one. Point two, sort of an attack on newness. And by newness I mean the idea of things that have just happened in the sense of news. And so 6 years ago I co-founded a company called Upworthy, which is a mission-driven media company aiming to draw massive amounts of attention to the stories that matter most. I got out of the fake news business and into sort of the hard story business. And one of our founding philosophies was that the things that were most important to our society often were not the most recently occurring. The big stories and the big ideas and the big social issues were long and slow and grinding and didn't have a press conference this morning. And we were instead focusing on the wrong thing. So I think we heard a lot each month about the monthly job numbers coming out of Washington. We didn't hear a lot about the sort of growing, broad economic insecurity that was crippling American families. We heard a lot every time a white woman would get kidnapped. We heard very little about the shockingly high rates of domestic abuse across our country. We hear a lot about plane crashes, not much about car crashes that kill many, many more people. A lot about the weather, not much about the climate. At Upworthy, we got tens of millions of people to watch videos about healthcare cost controls. We got countless millions to watch videos about body image and gender discrimination in the workplace. We got about stop and frisk, about income inequality, as demonstrated by two gorillas, about climate change through parody songs. If you were tuning into Upworthy to figure out what had happened today, you would be very poorly served. But if you were kind of tuning in to get a sense of what was really going on in our society, I think you left pretty satisfied, at least on our better days. I think that newsrooms in general ought to have a point of view about what matters in the world. I don't think that means you have to dismiss objectivity, but I think newspapers ought to and do. You know, they decide what news to cover, they decide what goes on the front page or at the top of the broadcast. I think you have to have that value system in order to do the job convincingly. I think we should also measure the success of newsrooms based on how effectively knowledge about and caring about those issues is conveyed to your audience. So that's a lot different than how most newspapers and journalists think about it. They think, did we cover a story really well? Did we break a story? Did we get some interesting facts out there, or did we get a scoop? But sort of as soon as they hit publish, it's out of their hands. And I think that's a really outdated way of thinking. I think that's from the days when it was literally out of your hands, when a newspaper would get printed and put in a truck and sent around to be put on doorsteps. But nowadays, we can know so much more. You can know who read the story. You can know who shared it. You can know who you're reaching and who you're not. And it's really cheap and easy to survey and understand the beliefs and knowledge of your audience. I think that in 2016, when people surveyed the beliefs and knowledge of their audience about one of the two major party contenders for president, what people heard was emails. I think there was a lot more to the story, and I think we should judge ourselves by what people hear and what they retain and what they care about, not just what we print each day. So, another thing we learned at Upworthy was how to fiddle the knobs on Facebook pretty effectively. And, you know, to good and ill. We learned it too well at some times. But it was very interesting to be very close to the metal on seeing which types of stories would drive engagement and which types of stories would depress engagement. And we saw it in some ways we would see it where we would tell a sort of boring, dry story with no point of view wouldn't get shared much. we thought that was a good learning. We thought, okay, if we want to write a story about climate change, or we want to find a great video about climate change, we should find one that has a point of view, is an engaging story, is surprising and delightful and shocking and outrageous, has some sort of the more pulpy, tabloidy feel that most people actually like. And because we cared about people caring about climate change, we sort of would go that extra level to make them more interesting. We also saw that negative feedback on Facebook dramatically reduces reach. And negative feedback is not just to things that are false, but to things that are troubling, to things that are controversial, to things that are disagreeable. So we would write racial justice stories, and we'd get all these unsubscribes from the page or negative comments, and Facebook would say, oh, we shouldn't actually spread this story about Black Lives Matter. Which is obviously very troubling to society if the most important issues get sort of quietly silenced because they're sort of not the most palatable or not the most generally agreeable. So when fake news reared its head in the political forum in 2016, I wasn't surprised. When you're very close to the data and seeing what works and what doesn't, it's easy to see how it's gameable. It's easy to see how you could use it for good or ill ends. And sort of the rules of the road on Facebook are not ethical. They're not civic-minded. They are largely amoral, or entirely amoral, largely user-focused, and then but with a sort of individualized sense of what users want rather than a sort of broad civic sense. About fake news, I think the problem, as I see it with fake news, is very little about actual fake news. I think the sense of fake news where an untrue story of the Pope endorsing Donald Trump or something like that being circulated and seen, I think that is a real and genuine issue and it ought to be solved. But I think it is, on the scope of things, much, much smaller than the issue of the president calling CNN and the New York Times fake news. I think that issue, which has sort of nothing to do with, I'm not defending Facebook, I think they have a lot of work to do, but I think that the real problem is that 50% of the people in our country don't believe in the most credible news organizations in our country. They've spent the last 80 or 90 years building their credibility, and now credibility itself is partisan. That is a really dramatically significant problem. Trying to figure out how to make people care about news that doesn't agree with their pre-existing ideas about the world is very, very difficult. The best term I've heard for it is tribal epistemology of news, which is from Fox, from somebody smarter than me and probably less smart than most of you. But the sense that if it's not for my tribe, if it's not for my team, I don't believe it. I think if I was running the New York Times or the Washington Post, I would love to ask the Bill and Len just their take on how to solve that. I don't think it's something that we can decry in small conferences and hope it gets better. I think that the large news organizations have to figure out how to be on people's side and not appear distant from them while holding on to the core principles and philosophies that make them so great. And I'll end on one last point, which is, I think it's easy, as somebody who likes the New York Times and likes fact-based journalism, to think that I like it for all the right reasons. But when my wife, we mentioned the New York Times in my wedding vows. It is a very core part of the identity of my wife and I. We have a print subscription, even though there's no reason to have a print subscription. I look in the wedding section to see if other Columbia alums have recently gotten married. When I flip through the New Yorker, I notice like long-running advertisers that I remember from my youth seeing and never bought from. Like, it is a cultural, these are cultural parts of our tribe, and I'm not presuming that everyone here is of the same tribe, but, and I think if there were all Duck Dynasty ads in all of them, I would feel weird about them. I would feel like they weren't for me. So I think these large news organizations that have huge newsrooms doing incredible work need to figure out how to present themselves in a way where they're not immediately dismissed and not immediately shut down, so that we can get back to a world in which we have some shared understanding of what's true and what matters.
I really feel like I got an excellent setup here because I'm gonna go deeply digital and very modern. So the developments that I'm talking about have occurred mainly since 2011, where we had a very big rush and excitement around participatory media, where lots of people were just then getting used to using smartphones. There was a lot of hyperconnectivity, Wi-Fi in public, hotspots, lots of data plans. It's interesting because in 2011 you could get an unlimited data plan, but that seems to actually have been rolled back, right? So, I'm trying to think about this moment where lots and lots and lots of people are starting to document public events, specifically going to be focusing today on public protests and the relationship between platforms, networked communication, and how protest journalism and participatory media have given a different model of how to think about what do people do online when they share something, right? I mean, we share a lot of stuff. We share a ton of stuff. And I'm not always sure why I share things, but I feel like I'm doing something when I share things. And so, I was introduced, my bio, I have a very varied history in approaching digital media and digital movements. I studied activist communication structures on the left. I now study activist communication structures on the very, 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 very far right. I have been privy to lots of disgusting things over the last 2 years by virtue of studying white supremacists prior to the election. So in the lead up to the election, white supremacists or ardent users of the internet, you could tell an entire history of the last 20 years of the internet by talking about how white supremacists have used the tools of online message boards to build communities, focused a lot on anonymization. And while I was studying Stormfront in 2015 to understand how they were using DNA ancestry tests to think about racial purity, I was online the day that Donald Trump made his infamous speech about illegals, quote unquote, and his extremely derogatory comments about Mexicans. And on Stormfront, white nationalists said, he blew it, it's over. Hang it up, because I could never say that at work. I'd be fired, I'd be run out of my house if they knew how I felt. And Donald Trump, of course, doubled down on that, and as he rose to prominence, so too did the fears of white supremacists in particular lessen, and they began to come out into the public space. They began to show up at his rallies. They began to network in public. They began to become public. And so that's the background for the presentation that I'm going to show you today. The title is You Are the Media, and I'm going to present a little bit of theory mixed with a few examples. And I'm hoping to have some interaction and discussion, because these are very much ideas in process. So I have two pictures up here today. On Halloween 2017, Milo Yiannopoulos, former Breitbart tech reporter, and now his own media corporation, Milo Inc., he gave a speech in front of several hundred fans at Cal State University Fullerton. The cost to entrance was $35, and charging the crowd money ensured that he would not suffer the fate of other controversial campus speakers, where the heckler's veto would make it impossible to carry on. As the energized crowd left the auditorium, they faced hundreds of protesters outside. But as they exited, they chanted, "Fake news, fake news, fake news." And I thought to myself, why? How did fake news become a protest chant? And at Data and Society, we've been thinking a lot about alternative media makers and how they leverage the broadcasting capacity of social media to build dedicated audience. Instead of posing fake news as a media literacy problem, we see fake news as a keyword in public discourse that helps us examine the increasingly important role sharing plays in legitimating alternative media outlets, as well as substantiating alternative realities. Today I will give an overview of 4 participatory media makers to illustrate how alternative media outlets use hyperpartisan and politicized frames to ensure their content is distributed across multiple platforms and networks, both increasing their distribution and their power in the process. Right now, every social media user is a consumer, producer, and distributor of media. Tiziana Terranova predicted this outcome in her early work on free labor, where she writes, "Online free labor is simultaneously voluntarily given and unwaged, enjoyed and exploited." In 2000, her work on free labor and the digital economy relied on an examination of moderators of message boards, email lists, and chat rooms, as well as those who made content for blogs and webmasters. But how might this theory change with the adoption of social media and the monetization of content? Now, most of us don't think of ourselves as content producers and moderators when we use social media, but content creation and moderation is more of the work or the free labor we do online, in our feeds, in our timelines, and in our careful curation of our dinner plates as we snap a photo for Instagram. This is rather obvious, but I will argue that we shouldn't just study the makers and purveyors of fake news, but rather we should focus on the organizing strategies of those who compel others to give them free labor in the service of creating an alternative and rival media network. So that is to say, there's a different kind of producer-consumer-distributor relationship on social media that has hybrid roots in media and in social movements. For movements, every user of social media is not only a potential producer or consumer, but is also a distributor of the message. Only certain kinds of media makers that seek to employ free laborers leverage this capacity. This is because the social media's users' like, view, or donation is also a vote, a confirmation, and a bump in the algorithmic economy. Sharing online is a kind of free labor that was made very easy with social media, and we embraced it heavily in 2011 because it helped our movements grow. And now I think we can see this tactic almost everywhere. To think through the power of the user as a distributor with the share button on ready requires us to rethink how the growing field of participatory media has acted as a beta test for an alternative media market. Fake news is a good topic to think with if we're trying to understand the development of an alternative media market that is competitive with established media outlets, not only in terms of profit, but also in terms of claims to truth and authority. So whereas many major media outlets work with the model of content creation, then distribute to the audience with the intent of monetizing clicks with ads and subscriptions, participatory media makers think more like movements. Here, media is made in order to spread messages. With each share, reach is increased. Because these media makers in movements have a low overhead for broadcast and storage, they concentrate on getting the audience to see their content as more than just reporting. Sharing is participating in the media production process and making a contribution to the movement overall. And these are just some kind of simple models that I like to think with in order to differentiate where we're now moved past this notion of the producer-consumer, but also thinking about the social media user as the distributor of news. And I use this to understand, I understand the communication model online as rhizomatic, which is the simultaneous use of multiple channels for collecting, sorting, and broadcasting information to coordinate action across different platforms. And so when movements are employing rhizomatic communication, they leverage all of these different spaces on the internet: websites, donation sites, social media, email, SMS groups, chat apps, discussion boards, phone and conference calls, podcasts, YouTube, streaming, and video. And so in order to make your movement seen online, you have to be in all of these different spaces online. It's no longer enough to have a website or a call to action. And a similar thing is occurring, I think, in media spaces that I'll show you in a moment, in established media organizations. But first, I want to do a word on how participatory media evolved out of movements understanding communication online. So parallel to protesters learning to coordinate across platforms, participatory media projects and networks began to take shape. And this is sort of the 2011 moment of Occupy and what's happening in Greece and what was happening in Tahrir Square. And lots of people were sharing these tactics. I met a lot of participatory media activists that were present in Spain in 15M, and people were learning to use their telephones to become citizen journalists. So as the tools for online broadcast developed, so too did the field of journalists who leveraged network technologies to build engaged audience. Both amateur, semi-professional, and professional citizen journalists now use a combination of multi-platform technologies to create, broadcast, and store original content. Throughout Occupy, the protests in Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, and now with the white supremacist protests, there's a heavy emphasis on real-time streaming of live protests. In these broadcasts, the streamers are often asking the audience to chat, share, and donate so that they can continue their media work. But also the audience is more than just part of the frame, they're part of the movement. And you can see lots of the similar tactics of participatory media map onto this kind of rhizomatic communication field. Increasingly as well, if you think with the distribution model of the New York Times online, this is their own graphic where they're talking about how over the course of 7 days they published over 1,600 posts across 9 platforms. That's quite a bit of messaging power, right? And I think it's an interesting thing where they think about, once it's out there, the distribution is largely out of their hands in the way that Peter was talking about it. And in this sense, cross-platform distribution has become the norm for most journalists, amateur and professionals alike. But in this professional model, audiences must be compelled to come to the website for some measure of quote-unquote free content before they are asked to subscribe for access to the entire corpus. But what in this model motivates subscription? And I think that fake news helps us think about, what does motivate people to actually subscribe then to the New York Times if they could move to another platform, either get a piece of that content for free or just find the story somewhere else. The paywall disincentivizes sharing and disengages the audience from becoming the media. So I'm going to move into giving 4 overshots of participatory media makers that I think are interesting in the moment. Tim Poole began covering protests during the Occupy movement, then became a reporter for Vice covering international protests. He's broadcasted Ferguson and Black Lives Matter protests, and now he frequently covers alt-right protests. And I have here a few of his major sites with the kind of metrics he's been able to build over the last 6 years. And metrics are an important measure of worth, value, and legitimacy, but as Peter pointed out, they also help you understand what your audience wants. You can even find out on YouTube at what point people stop watching your content, right? So you can do a lot of things to customize your message in order to meet the demands of the audience. As well, with every subscriber, you're creating a repository of attention as well as a repository of possibilities for activating free labor and distribution. Now with Tim, there's an interesting thing happening right now with YouTube, which has begun to demonetize what they call political content. And he claims to be losing thousands of dollars by using their platform to broadcast. He's also not receiving direct donations from viewers, though, for a variety of reasons. His ability to broadcast is often framed as a free speech right to press issue that requires donations to overcome his quote-unquote suppression of his rights. However, because he has moved from covering protests on the left to the right, there's a reputational issue whereby his objectivity is often contested. While he attempts to walk the fine line of objectivity, citing that he's part Korean and therefore cannot be a white supremacist, he's often harassed at protest and charged with being fake news. Tim's ambiguity about his political position is a barrier to mobilization of his audience. So As well, Unicorn Riot is considered a very far left collectivist live stream collective that takes both money in and it takes in both money and Bitcoin donations. But none of the streamers in their network are able to do this work without subsidizing their income in other ways. They began covering events during Occupy, Justice for Trayvon Martin, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, and now are publishing leaks from far-right message boards and chat rooms. Right, so instead of taking the tact of going and just filming far-right protests, they're also actively trying to get people to circulate content about who is part of these far-right movements, which is really involving the audience in the process itself. They'll often ask for information. If you know anything, please let them know. And their reach is similar in some ways in terms of metrics to Tim Poole's. The Red Elephants are a group that are also a network collective of live streamers that developed during Trump's campaign. And they describe themselves as a media militia covering protests and conducting live doxing at protests and infiltration of leftist groups. This is different. Doxing means that you're collecting information on people. They will hold up their camera and point it at people and say, "Tell me who this is," to the audience. Or they'll say hello to 4chan, which is that they know the people who are watching, primarily that are part of this message board culture, 4chan, as well as on Discord, are at the ready to help them become information purveyors within the movement. The audience is very activated, very engaged, and what's interesting about them and their coverage lately of activists is they will go to leftist groups' meetings for the purpose of documenting who's part of what they consider communist movements. They are constantly getting into fights with Refuse Fascism, or that group that you see the signs that say no everywhere. And this kind of live streaming is very different from the live streaming that we've seen in the past, where they've gamified it in a way where the audience is actively engaged in spreading the information and more than just tweeting out the link. Lastly, Milo Yiannopoulos is an interesting case because he's a hybrid model that seeks to monetize viewership but also cultivate a following by using his media celebrity to orchestrate controversial events. Without protests and coverage that follows them, his speaking events would not generate the controversy necessary to make his media work relevant. But what's important here is that he, like Bannon with Breitbart, are playing with the alternative media market to see what level of institutionalization is necessary to build a large and dedicated audience, but also how do you activate the free labor in that audience to share and distribute your messages and potentially only your messages. Here, the larger the audience, the greater the potential distribution. With every new subscriber, there's an exponential reach across different market segments. When layering this with personalized advertising, the media maker is not dependent on subscribers or any specific set of advertisers. Instead, they activate free labor to distribute content and fight for its legitimacy on their own profiles. So people will post a Breitbart article with the intent of defending it in their news feeds or in their timelines. Here, every share on Facebook newsfeed isn't only meant to be read, it's meant to provoke emotion, discussion, and to activate participation. And it's very clear in the framing of it that when you're doing this, you're doing it for a particular kind of movement. In sum, not only has the creation of content changed dramatically with social media, so has the mechanisms and meanings of distribution. Hyper-partisan outlets rely on making audiences into active participants, where every share means more than just collectivism. It's an ideological culture war where facts, values, and authority circulate in metric cues. Metrics are critical here. The larger the audience, the more participation. The bigger the network grows, the bigger the measure of the movement, the further the reach, and the more delegitimized the establishment, right? Because they will often say, well, our story on that got shared many more times than this other rival network. I imagine we'll see many more Milos who play on the hyper-partisanship and trolling to grow their base, seeded with millionaires' money. But for now, as multi-platform publications become the norm, distribution is largely out of the hands of established media gatekeepers if they refuse to engage audiences in terms of the kind of emotions that they want to enact, but also because audiences will hit share if they think it's doing something more than just giving information. Some media literacy groups have begun talking about public health campaigns to stop the flow of fake news. And they're talking about things like, instead of don't text and drive, we should have campaigns that are think before you share. But I think we're really beyond this kind of intervention. And the movement is in the metrics, and we have all become the media. And sharing, like, it feels good now, you know? So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. This has been a fascinating panel that's taken us from the very beginnings of the modern press and modern journalism right up to today via some important questions on the responsibility of the traditional mainstream media in dealing with this. I'd also like to thank all of our speakers for keeping very scrupulously to time. We're going to take a quick break now for 10 minutes for go and have a cup of coffee, and we'll be back for further discussion and questions from the audience. For the next 20 minutes or so is opening the floor for questions, comments and discussion, and if and when our next our panelists arrive, we will hand it over to them for a final summing up perhaps. So, do we have any questions, comments, observations? Perhaps I'll use my own or abuse my own power from the chair to ask to begin with, and it's a question for all of us or all of our panelists. But I suppose in the first instance, for Joan, since what you presented to us is so contemporary and so urgent, and the thoughts that was going through my head was, what on earth are we going to do? How do we respond to this? I'm a student of horror, and it reminded me of those films in which large people are overwhelmed by tiny creatures, by ants. that we cannot stop them. There's a massification going on here. Help is my question.
Well, there's two things that YouTube's been doing in terms of their services. One is that they've been making it increasingly less disincentivizing by demonetizing, right? So what's been interesting to me to watch the development of these streaming technologies over time is they come on the market, they're layered with chat, so in the chat rooms people are actively talking to each other, and it's goofy, but YouTube layered into the chat a function where you know you're not going to be heard, so they have a super chat function where you can pay $5 or $10 to have your comment pinned at the top of the chat. And so in these live streams, often they're getting donations live that then it's customary for them to read back the response, which is usually read the comment and then give a response to it. And that's where most of the trolling and the really disconcerting stuff happens, where they're getting people to say things like, Hitler was right, Hitler was a good guy, hail Nazi, hail Nazis. And then the streamer themselves is like, thanks for the $10, Hitler was good, and it's just, so YouTube is starting to roll back some of those features for certain people, and they're making certain kinds of videos unsearchable. But as I'm trying to show you, this is a multi-platform, cross-platform problem. They don't think about well, if YouTube isn't doing the thing that I want it to do, I'm moving to Periscope or I'm moving to Facebook Live. And so they're constantly, using the seams between platforms as levers to keep in touch with their audiences and to compel their content into the world, but also that in order to do this, they need money, right? And so long as they're able to get payment from Patreon or they make their own payment, platforms like Patreon or WeSearcher, there's really not a good solution to it, right? Other than, someone like in Peter's position, which is like maybe you just out attention them, right? Like you come for the attention and you do counter narratives and you do counter streaming and you do, but it's like unless people are willing to invest in this kind of infrastructure, especially far left or even leftist or center or even center right, you're going to see this kind of partisanship in this world of streaming. And part of it is that it's going to take all of us.
The cavalry has arrived, General. I'll just explain that I put a question to all of us because in the light of some illuminating and frankly disturbing presentations this morning, what we want to do. So what I propose is that if Peter and Andie can give us all some suggestions, and then we can hand over to Cathy, and then after that we'll round off with questions. Sure. And so then we'll round off with questions from those. I hope you notice this is unflappable master of ceremony. Help.
Well, they're very hard problems to solve. I think that it's good to start by assessing what's really going on and dealing with things as they are rather than as we wish they would be. I think that what the purveyors of fake news and racist movement building and other things have done really well is capture latent psychological anger and resentment and grievance on the far, far right and sort of weaponize that. I think that, as Joan said, one answer is to let's try to capture the energy on our side. I think that it's there's a burning t-shirt somewhere in the audience, but I think that there's I think that as we lost gatekeepers and as we lost a sense of what's inbounds in national conversation, that opened the door to the Nazis to start having protests, but it also opened the door to us to actually talk about Medicare for all and other ideas that were too far out of the mainstream before. So I think if we can follow the energy toward the side of light rather than the side of darkness, and obviously I'm not impartial, then that can help to a certain extent. It's a bit of a dangerous path because it's easier to break something than to build something, and it's easier to destroy than create. And so trying just to go toe-to-toe with hate and love is I hope it ends well, but it's a tough bet to take. But I do think that understanding the information environment, understanding human psychology and how people are using these tools and why, and then building new media properties and new movements that try to fill the gaps is as good a place to start as any.
Historical perspective?
Well, as a historian, I feel sometimes my job is to say, well, we've lived through worse. It's not worse now than it's ever been. And we have. Here's proof. We have lived through other stuff. Our former dean, Nick Lemon, when he was establishing the course in journalism history required of our journalism students, he said it will help them to know that we've fallen off the cliff before and we got back up. There do seem to be very striking differences between this moment of crisis and previous moments of crisis. the speed and the all-pervasiveness of the media landscape is, I think, something quite unprecedented. Although generations have thought that before. In 1898, I think it was, George Beard wrote a book about American nervousness, 1903, when he said, we're all going to die. Everybody has stomach aches, everyone has migraines, everyone is in terrible physical health because everything is so fast. Look at magazines. But things are much faster now in a way that is frightening because the velocity seems to strip all capacity for thought. The constantness of the media soup we're all in seems to be more pervasive and more consuming and more and harder to get away from. So I don't know how to suggest what to do or where to go. People have figured things out before. People have solved things before. Sometimes they're worse. Sometimes they're better. What I tell myself is nevertheless, we will persevere.
Thank you. So I'll now hand over to Matt Jones. The floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Jones, and I teach history here. So this morning has been wonderful in actually this lack of nostalgia, in the way that it set up so beautifully the sort of contingency of the kind of solution to the production of news in the 20th century, and the ways in which that involved a deliberate omission of a lot of factors of style, of emotive reach, and other sorts of things, which all play into the kind of a current moment. And I think not having a nostalgia-tinged vision of the solutions to knowledge in the past is important looking ahead. So what we're going to do now is talk a little bit with Cathy O'Neill, who's been a major commentator on the place and dangers and exaggerations around algorithms that are trained on large amounts of data in a whole range of. Cathy is a mathematician who also was a quant on Wall Street, involved in Occupy, wrote a wonderful book called Weapons of Math Destruction last year that I strongly recommend, and is also quite importantly a major blogger who combines in a really fantastic way in one's great technical expertise, skepticism about existing institutions with a particular style that I think is important. We've been talking a lot about the centrality of style. I could say a lot more about things Cathy does, but rather I think I might just pick up where the conversation just was. And so in your book and a lot of your writings, you've written about the power and dangers of algorithms, but constantly you also call our attention to exaggerations about those dangers or misapprehensions. So in thinking in the general domain of fake news, what are some of the ways that people are diagnosing things incorrectly, and what are some of the ways that they're doing it well, all pointing towards, if we're going to come up with some solutions to this, what format might those solutions take?
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for having me, and I want to apologize for being so late. And I expect that I will be repeating things that people said already, and I apologize for that too. So just everyone can just go like this if they've heard before. So I wrote a little free ebook that's available on Amazon.com free called On Being a Data Skeptic. And it was like, the audience was like a business audience, but what's good about it is it's free. And it's short, and it's like maybe 10 pages. And the idea was for me to explain, I wrote this in 2012, I want to say, 2013 or something like that, about like how people are both over worried about data and under worried about data. And the under worried about data, I worry about more. The under worry about data is that, people, and it's probably outside this room for the most part, people like think that algorithms must be perfect. I don't know if you guys heard, if you've read the Wall Street Journal article maybe yesterday or 2 days ago about Ray Dalio in Bridgewater. So Ray Dalio has the biggest hedge fund in the world called Bridgewater, and he really is a believer in algorithms. He wants to replace himself with an algorithm. And I can talk a lot more because was at the TED conference with him about how much he believes in algorithms. But the thing that was in the Wall Street Journal that was interesting was about a woman who was harassed at Bridgewater by second in command. And it was like a he said, she said situation. So what they did was they looked at the algorithm and decided that he must be telling the truth because his believability score was higher than hers. So the algorithm said that she was lying. That was the conclusion. Now, I think the good news is that she sued and won outside. So that wasn't the final word. But the bad news is there's a lot of algorithms that are over-trusted and they are the final word. And that blind faith in algorithms is something that I worry about all the time. And my book is really devoted to trying to bust that blind faith and trying to get people to just think, what could be going wrong, how could biases be embedded in this algorithm, etc. Or like what kind of accuracy scores, what is evidence in the context of an algorithm working or not working? What is evidence? Now I'm going to repeat the word evidence a few times because that's really what we're talking about nowadays with respect to fake news, is we're always looking at what constitutes evidence, what is persuasion, and what kind of evidence will persuade people, and it doesn't have to actually be factual. So I want to talk a little bit about what scares me about trusting algorithms too much, but also I don't want people to think that algorithms are not something that we need to worry about. Which is to say that I think, well, let me say it this way. Fake news is not an algorithmic problem. I'll say it that way. Fake news is a human problem. And I say that essentially because Twitter is not an algorithm. Twitter is almost not algorithmic. It's a designed community. It's a social media network. People bring in news from outside, but there's no algorithmic gatekeeper that is keeping me from seeing things. I see everything that everyone I follow ever tweets, as long as I look enough, right? It's chronological order, so depending on what time of day I see different things. There are promoted things, but I skip them. I'm just making the point that it's not censoring in the sense that the Facebook algorithm does. And yet, Twitter has plenty of problems. So it's not that algorithms are the culprit here. In fact, if anything, we might look to algorithms to help us solve some of these problems. Now, I don't think that's going to be a total solution because I think algorithms also are. Let me say it this way: we do not have AI that understands a model of the world in a comprehensive enough way to understand the difference between fake news and evidence. So we'll never be able to build an algorithm that can discern between fake news and real news. Algorithms are really good at some things, like very finite universes where definitions of success are clear, things like chess and Go, and sports, and elections, things that are very finite. And that's why when you talk to AI experts, they're going to constantly talk about chess, Go, sports, and elections. But they're not going to talk about things where it's very, very unclear what it means to be right, or what it means to be successful in a larger context where there are different kinds of stakeholders, where there are different kinds of definitions of success. Long answer to a short question. But I first of all don't think that fake news is an algorithmic problem, and second of all, algorithms won't solve it, but algorithms might aid humans in dealing with it.
So it's really striking how hapless actually Twitter and Facebook seem in the face of this. And you recently wrote an article in Bloomberg, maybe Facebook is broken, which made some of the, what is the, in terms of or if these are organizations that are fundamentally see themselves as algorithmic, what is it that we ought to be encouraging them to operationalize in order to overcome some of the problems that they have if it's not technical solutions?
All right, so this is what I do all the time, but I'm going to refuse to answer that question. I'm going to question the premise of that question, which was that there is something that Facebook can do. Mm-hmm. My claim in that article and my current claim is that there is nothing we can do to Facebook to fix it. that it is endemic to the concept of social media, that people will bring in news they want to hear. I personally left Facebook after the election, almost exactly a year ago, because I just saw all my fellow Bernie Sanders echo chambery friends posting things that were ludicrous. Like, literally like, oh, you know, it's not too late to change the election result. And I'm like, dude, yes it is. What has happened to you? And you're like a 45-year-old professor with a PhD, stop. You know? And it just seemed like this is not an algorithm problem. This is a human problem. Now, I just want to say that I'm not trying to let Facebook off the hook whatsoever. Facebook has an algorithm, and it's a terrible algorithm. It's very destructive. And they make money in ways that directly threaten democracy. And like a whole chapter of my book at the end is devoted to political tailored ads and the asymmetry of information between political campaigns and human beings and voters, and how they get to tell us what they want us to hear instead of what we want to know about politicians. That's how Facebook makes money, billions of dollars off that crap. And it is a threat to democracy because it prevents us from ever knowing what a politician actually stands for. Even if we go to their websites, they're going to track us with cookies. They, oh, we know you, we've already profiled you, here's the thing that you agree with the most about our candidate. We'll never be able to get real information, and that's very frustrating. Besides the advertisements that I think are destructive, they have their actual algorithm, which is a gatekeeper. It is censorious, so let's not talk about like, oh, should Facebook censor? Facebook already censors, right? Probably already heard this already. But it has decided to optimize to engagement, which is just awful. And it has created the clickbait journalism culture, and it has, and I think the thing that is most vicious about Facebook is the thing that's most vicious about all bad algorithms, which is that bad algorithms, they claim, the makers, the people who build them claim that they're predictive, but what they don't just predict, right? They actually create the future. So we have people who, oh, I wanted to hear that, now I believe it, I've moved a little bit to the side. And now I see more information that I want to believe, and it moves me further to the side, to the point where people are just being pushed further and further out. So it's not just what they want to see, it's what's going to actually affect their beliefs. And so I want to place I want to place blame at the foot of Facebook for making everything about social media worse. But having said all that, like, I don't think if they flipped off their algorithm, things would be better. I don't think if they moved to the Twitter chronological, like you'll see everything that all your friends put on Facebook, so chronologically, if they moved to that sort of simple, you wouldn't even call it an algorithm, right? Simple feed. I don't think that would solve the problem. And I think that's where we are right now in the discussion. We're just like, oh, what can we do to nudge Facebook in the direction where it doesn't fuck up the world? And I'm like, maybe it will work. Maybe we will literally, first of all, I want to think big. Like, I want to think, if it would work, what would it look like? Number one, I would say no more tailored advertising at all. That would completely ruin the Facebook business model if we never ever had tailored advertising. But I think that's okay for me. I don't know if it's okay for you. Like, yeah, find out another way of maybe charge subscriptions. I don't know. Tailored advertising is really bad. But again, like, you still have people bringing stuff in. You still have people sorting themselves in tribes and becoming more and more tribal and echo chambery. I just don't think we could tweak it.
So, okay, I want to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
We could talk a lot about that.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
If you guys want to run too.
Okay, this is just the last question. So, in some way, a lot of what we're talking about is a kind of dystopic turnabout of the vision in the 90s of how there's going to be a sort of radical utopianism in which we democratize the production of news and information. And that those would precisely overcome all of the limitations we know of standard journalistic endeavors and other kinds of things. And it's precisely that we've so screwed up, as it were, the radical democratization of the production of knowledge, that we seem to be in this awful place. Now, what I wanted to ask you about is, you've already alluded to a book you publish. You now publish in places like Bloomberg and the New York Times, but you've also been a blogger for some time. And as I said in the introduction, the blog combines, as it were, in equal measure, I don't know, stats and math knowledge, outrage, and it has a fevered stylistic pitch that's in part of a political engagement. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it would, the engagement of the kind of journalism, commentary, and other sorts of work you've been doing for a long time, and what sort of future there is for not, say, reviving credentialed media, but rather reviving that which was so exciting about the democratization of knowledge production in the 90s and early 2000s.
Wow, that's just a small question.
Yeah, small.
I have to admit, like confession, like I don't consider myself a writer. And I didn't even know I had a style of writing. So thanks for informing me.
Your falsehoods and stuff.
No.
No, I mean, you're not your self-knowledge, but that
Yeah.
you're not a writer.
No, I mean, I kind of recognize that I have a style, and somebody described it to me as polemic. I had to look it up. I don't know. Yeah, so I just started. I started my blog, Math Babe, after leaving 2 years of working at a hedge fund during the crisis, then 2 years working at a risk company, and being disillusioned both by the way the crisis had evolved through mathematical lies in the form of AAA ratings and mortgage-backed securities, and then when I was trying to fix the risk model for the credit default swaps market, I found that no one cared. Literally no one wanted to know what the risk was on their credit default swap portfolio because they don't like risk because they get their bonuses are ratios of their profit to their risk, and they want to decrease that denominator and increase the numerator. So I just was outraged, and I started the blog basically to warn other mathematicians, don't do what I did and go into finance because it's a snake pit and it's not it doesn't have mathematical integrity, and it doesn't, it's just a disingenuous place. And so that was the style I wrote, right? Because I was outraged, so I started writing. And I started in 2011, and back then people like wrote blogs and they read blogs, and I was pretty excited. It was amazing actually. It was an amazing way of just entering the conversation, especially because I was filling a gap in a certain sense of people who suspected but weren't sure about these questions of like dishonest modeling within finance. I don't think that lives anymore. I don't know. I can't really tell. People, like I still have faithful readers of my blog. I think there are faithful readers of blogs. There are people that read blogs. But it's certainly not in style like it was then. I don't know if a person who has a similar experience to me and wants to tell people about it would be able to do what I did. So that's sad. It's sad because I would never have ended up wearing a mount if I hadn't had that. I would never have thought to go to journalism school and earn credentials to become an official contributor to that conversation. So I'm afraid I don't have really good news in that, because I do think that like most of the social media forums now are kind of corrupted, and I think people know that. And I don't know where to send someone with like fresh ideas and a fresh voice.
So I just want to pick up that, that someone describes your work as polemical, or work, it is precisely cast as a negation of its truthfulness. That is, it's cast, I mean, that's a sort of...
that person.
No, but I mean, that's exactly it, that we're in an epistemological moment in which our conventions of what it is to be truth-telling would make a polemic and opposite of that. And Nietzsche titled The Genealogy of Morals a polemic. And one of his claims was that it is only through the polemical form that you can truly do philosophy, thereby rejecting what was a sort of canon of philosophy. And indeed, it seems to me that's the moment where we're challenging. By looking at the history and the long tradition here, we are asking ourselves to have solutions which are going to be maybe quite different in form from a solution that had particular style, particular understanding of what it was for the collection of evidence. None of which is to abandon something like a value like objectivity, but to say there's going to be different technical tools and different social organizations that are necessary. And we actually have to think much bigger than thinking there's going to be an easy answer in a Twitter or a Facebook algorithm. Okay, I think our time is up, Cathy, but thank you very much. And I think we have time for questions for this session as well.
Yeah, we do. So just to close, and questions, comments, observations to anybody around the table, except for me. Maybe in front.
Yes, this is to Professor Tucker, and I enjoyed what you were speaking. I'm wondering about the difference between fake and propaganda. In my 17th century, newsletters were coming about, and in Italy, coming out of Rome, they actually did go through the propaganda process, so that some ended up published in Venice or slipped out or whatever. But, and so as I say, I wonder about the differentiation between the two, because these were political, but some of your 19th century ones were not, I gather, just for circulation. I mean, every little Connecticut town was either the ex-Republican or the ex-Democrat as titled in the newspaper, it seems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, fake means so many different things. As we see in current usage, fake now is applied to so many different kinds of misinformation, disinformation. I think the point I want to make about the 19th century press is that there always is what you might call propaganda, particularly in times of war or conflict, particularly in times of electoral politics. But to think about the information value of the news produced in the 19th century, some of it was not truthful and never intended to be truthful. It was seen as entertainment, was seen as fun, was seen as a way to, put a stick in the eye of the professors in the East. One needs to take a very large view of what we mean by truth and falsehood in this era, and understand how readers might have come to those decisions, made their own decisions, and confronted those. When I teach my journalism history class, the students always argue about what's propaganda. Is propaganda good or bad? And some of them always says, well, maybe it can be good, which is in a good cause, in a reasonable cause. Definitions are really hard. Thinking widely about how people confronted their newspapers makes better sense to me.
Cathy just described social media as, I think, hopelessly corrupted. And I'm interested in corrupted by what? Darryl, you asked Joan a little while ago, sort of what do we do, right, about the ways people are using these platforms. And I think a critique that could be made is that one of the reasons there's nothing to do is that these platforms are operated by companies that view engagement by users amorally, right? They want more users and they want more engagement because that's what makes them money, right? So no one's, I think, said the word capitalism yet, but it seems like that's one pretty obvious way of understanding this, right? As long as the companies that operate these platforms and increasingly constitute the public sphere in our society have no interest or regulatory onus in responsibility for the things that people say on them, or in making any distinctions between good and bad kinds of speech, then, as Joan says, there's nothing to be done, right? Is that what you meant social media is corrupted by, or is it even worse than that?
That's a large part of it, yeah. I think it's corrupted by trolls as well. But, if you don't mind, I'm just going to say that, one of the things that I think about when I think about this capitalism problem is this a concept of a public broadcasting internet or social network with local control and local concepts of what's appropriate. Whatever local means on the internet, though. Huge caveats, including but if the government controls it, then is it surveilling us? And he knows way more about that than I do. But do you know what I mean? Just what would a non-commercial social network look like? And how many of the big problems that we see on Facebook could be solved in that context? And I think that's a really important question. Because I don't think people are gonna stop wanting to be, in touch with their high school friends. And they deserve that, but they don't deserve everything that they're getting.
I think that one thing that's sort of at work here is the business model of these companies has a lot to do with collecting all kinds of data on you and then selling them to all kinds of different actors and players. And we have very little knowledge or control over what it is that they collect and sell. I've heard anything from Facebook collects and sells 800 to 2,000 points of data on each person. I've been watching and tracking the monetization of different groups through, you can target any kind of keyword that you put into your profile. You can then use that's monetized, and you can use that to promote your pages or your product or your post. And what's interesting, like one of the keywords that I've been tracking is Antifa. Right? There's 1.2 million people in reach that has been monetized, and this is the field, which is different, which is if I want to do a kind of political mobilizing, then I have to think through different frames. And the personalization and the granularity of those things, where I could target not only people who support Antifa or have Antifa in any of their likes or have shared content that has Antifa in the headline, I can get that granular, and then I can micro-target it to 10 miles within New York City. And this is what we saw with Russian gaming of these platforms, is they targeted, they promoted an event for a Not My President protest right after the election, so it was November 12th in New York City. And with that, targeting and promoting of this event, they also captured in another bucket the people who agreed to go to that protest, and so 33,000 people agreed to go to that. And then you can select and send content directly to that bucket that you've created, right? And so there is something about this micro-targeting that is really problematic, and especially if it's used in an offensive way, right? If it's used to disincentivize participation, or to talk poorly about CNN or whatever it is. And so I do think that Cathy's right in terms of the business model has to change, and a part of it has to do with this layer that's below the surface that normal users never get to see. So if you come for the back end and change their business model, then you change all the ways in which we see different kinds of information show up.
I just want to pick up on the word gaming that you used, because it gets at the way in which capitalism, and particularly the form of capitalism in which these platforms are working, is a crucial explanation, but inadequate. Because the thing about gaming, and I've learned this a lot from people, Joan and other researchers, there's the constitution of a collective knowledge of how to game these things. It's not that it's just given. I mean, the metrics enable certain ways of thinking, but there's been this production of knowledge in which, a massive dispute about video games and sexist culture was actually the training ground for people to learn how to game these sorts of things. So there's a layer which is very much a kind of social knowledge layer, and then it's been played. It's quite clear by the Russians, and that's a really, and so in any kind of diagnosis, what's going on, it's going to have to get at the political economy, while recognizing the limits of the political economy and the algorithms as an explanation for what is going on. And then any imagination of what's going to overcome that, we're going to have to recognize people are going to work against and using the affordances of systems. And if we make, say, a public internet, it's going to still be gameable. Now, it's not going to be gameable in exactly the same sort of ways, but we have to be ready and recognize that, our government has perception management, the Russians have active measures, those are both going to be gameable, these ways of gamifying, and I think we need to be conscious of that.
I'm just going to jump in once more and say, one of the sort of critical ingredients of the financial crisis was the gaming by investment banks of those AAA rated mortgage-backed securities. And it built the bubble up. It made it much, much bigger because people kept trusting these mathematical risk models in time investment bankers insisted that they be untrustworthy. And I feel like I've always sort of, since my experience in finance and seeing the crash that happened afterwards, I've always said, what will the crash look like in data science? What will the analogous crash look like? And I feel like we're starting to see the bubble and now the crash. I don't think it's quite as clear how we should solve it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we solved the financial crisis problem.
Oh, there's people over there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gentleman over there.
Yes, this is kind of coming at things from a different angle, but the issue of contemporary news is maybe not fake but twisted, and that is the closeness of the news purveyors to the news makers. If you go back to the period of time just prior to the invasion of Iraq, on all of the major channels, they had the generals and all these major figures that were being interviewed, and we got a very twisted view of actually what was going on. And I'm old enough to remember I.F. Stone's Weekly, where he talked about this. You don't need to be close to senior people. All you have to do is read the congressional record. And that seems to me to be a really major problem now, that we get our news, the initial filter is who they choose to interview on the, or quote, mainstream press. So, anybody have any comments?
I have an interesting insight from last week. I was on a panel with the general counsel from BuzzFeed. One of the things that came up was how tweets have augmented the way that they do man-in-the-street reporting. And so BuzzFeed was saying, well, tweets are kind of like man in the street. You can monitor events that are happening in different locations. You can get different insights from different people. And BuzzFeed really, inserts a lot of tweets into their reporting. And sort of my counterbalance to that was, yeah, but without a reporter in the street that can look this way and look this way and tell you if the event is even happening or has their own understanding of what's around them, we really open ourselves up to alternative explanations, disinformation, especially disinformation at scale, which I've been talking with Chris Wiggins about, which is this notion of reality jamming, where you can make up false events, and if you spread them across platforms and you seed them so that when you nudge a reporter to take a look for Pizzagate, it's all over the place, and they think, how did I miss this, right? But at the same time, that gaming and that playing the territory out online then is part of the way that these manipulations work. And so I agree with you that not only is it that they choose to interview certain, very status-heavy individuals, but also that they've lost the thing that makes events real. The localization, the fact-checking in that kind of way as well.
Journalists always make choices whenever they interview somebody, whenever they decide to pursue this story rather than that story, when they decide to put this story on the front page and that story inside, or to hold this one over that one. I think where the difference comes in now particularly, and I'm getting back to what I said earlier about rules, about it's hard to know what rules that journalism organizations follow most of the time. We have a sense that something like a mainstream newspaper follows a certain set of rules, adheres to ethical conduct. If they make mistakes, they'll acknowledge it. They know what they're supposed to do, even if they don't always do it, and certainly they don't always do it. I'm not defending them, but they know what they're supposed to do. We know how to hold those people accountable. They know when they need to apologize. There's another whole layer out there of other kinds of journalism, however, that has its own rules, that makes its own rules, and that will see nothing wrong in seeking out one very particular political point of view and honing in on that and focusing on that. That's what's the challenge, I think, of the media landscape now, is to figure out what the difference is between those, other than a few traditional, or the organizations we followed all along and have learned to trust or not to trust and how to evaluate them. It's a lot harder to know how to deal with the information that's out there, understanding that, of course, everything that's out there has been chosen by somebody.
Just one thing, lots of people on the right are invoking Chomsky regularly. And so it's an interesting phenomenon in which the right-wing critique of fake news is parasitic on a completely legitimate set of critiques, such as you're suggesting, about the way in which established journalism, the mainstream media, that was a left-wing critique that had been mobilized in a powerful way, and there's a truth to it. And I think the danger is if we are too sanguine or nostalgic about the way in which the tension comes, then it is only those kinds of institutions that have the reach and the financial to do a serious investigative reporting. So I think this is a particularly nasty mix in which you have this parasitism on what is a legitimate critique. And I mean, many of your actors on the left, Joan, they are part of that critique. And I think we need to have that. You know, it's not accidental that Fox News was premised on essentially a left-wing critique of the news that turned to a different purpose.
So a number of journalists I know think that a way out might be to hold the platforms, and forgive me because probably the terminology, I don't do Facebook or whatever, so I'm really lost it, but anyway, the platforms should be held to the same sort of standards that broadcast journalism is, or print journalism, or something on that order. So I guess so that you can say anything you want on Twitter or on social media, but you can't curse on national television or something. So I guess I'm wondering about if that sort of move to accountability might make it manageable.
That would be the worst internet ever. And it's the reason why I don't watch cable TV, right? Because it's kind of boring. There's nothing exciting there. What's exciting about the streams, that when it's happening and it's live, people are swearing, things are crazy, there's fist fights. I mean, there's things that you wouldn't air. I watch the same protest on local news and they always have to go, oh, we got cut, right? They move the camera away from that stuff. And there are bipartisan efforts for this Honest Ads Act.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I think people should be allowed to curse. It's not.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is that too much regulation,
right.
You end up losing the things that made us love the internet, I think, in the first place. What's difficult that's shifted is that we're not using the full breadth of the internet. You don't go to the website first, you open social media first, and that has a set of layers and filters and values that have changed our culture, different from if you were to open up your Explorer. I mean, nobody uses Explorer anymore, right? But if you were and think about, well, I want to go to the New York Times today, and you would type it in and you would go there, right? So the way that we've curated our feeds and mixed them with all kinds of different media and messaging has, changed the way we consume internet cultures, right? And so, and platforms are, they're a main way we get through the internet, right? Facebook in some parts of the world is the internet. And so that's difficult, right? In some senses, the election problem here is different than thinking through what it would mean to give the internet to other countries where they only have access to Facebook, right? And so, and then the things and the models and the regulations you impose here are then going to become the infrastructure of information for lots of other people by proxy. Mm-hmm. And so it's a difficult thing to manage. But also the amount of advertising that's happening per minute is probably more than capacity to hire for to watch, right? I mean, there probably thousands of transactions a minute, right? And I think Facebook's advertising revenue last year was $44 billion, right? So we don't even know how much the flows are. So it's a very difficult thing to think about at scale for, can you even hire enough people to vet all of that advertising or all of that content?
I just know that, as a result of our election, the elections that took place in Europe, Germany, for example, they didn't shut it down, but they managed to, to put in some kinds of rules and regulations and what they were to minimize the.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and totally disagree with you? I absolutely think we have to hold the platforms accountable, and I think that means they're gonna hire thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and that's a good thing. And they're gonna part of it should be that they make their editorial policies transparent, and a lot of people will be like, hey, that's not what I signed up for. Good, leave. I'd be happy for Facebook to shrink. Go to a different social media site that has a different transparent policy. Accountability is what we're missing. And there's no reason to think we can't have it. And if there's too much work for the people, hire more people. You've already ruined journalism. Use some of your profits to pay for these people. I don't think we're getting what we signed up for. Like, in other words, there is an editorial policy now, but it's just commercialism and capitalism. So just we need to see it. We need to agree to it. We don't need to all like it, right? We don't all like the policies of any given media company. So we go to a different one that we like more. That's going to happen. But I absolutely think we should do that.
And we have time for one final question from our Andie chamber.
Thanks. In relationship to this whole question of regulation and it's not exactly on this, but I'm wondering whether when you speak to, and you mentioned the finance people not being at all interested in being corrected, I'm wondering what you've heard actually from government, and not only because we've had recently too, and related, learning through the ProPublica expose that the Supreme Court does not know how to read statistics, and that they have made fundamental, about our most basic rights, that they've taken the voting rights down, they've misread DNA evidence, all that stuff, and that's a lot of that data coming from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And and I'm wondering whether your kinds of critiques, because you're one of the people who's sort of, people are now talking about really bringing in the top scientists and readers of these new kinds of data and new methods of analysis in to actually set up some kind of body or consult with them so that they can do this work on their own. I'm wondering whether, Cathy O'Neill, you have been engaged in any of these kinds of things, or you've seen any kind of sign that your work and your point of view is being heeded and sort of taken in and imbibed and being used in some way to sort of create some kind of fundamental change?
Wow. That's a long sentence. I would say that I've talked to a lot of senatorial aides. Some of them are the ones that are talking to, the senators are the ones talking to, the general counsels of Twitter, Facebook, and the other, Google, last week. I've been talking to people in the open markets, the part that was kicked out of New America by Eric Schmidt. So the antitrust people, I've been talking to them about what it would look like to break up Facebook and hold it accountable. So yeah, in that sense. It's much bigger than algorithms, right? Like, my book is pretty focused on algorithms. I think this is a bigger question than algorithms. This is a question of information itself in the digital age. And so I don't have all the answers. But I definitely think we need to build new political tools to address the questions that are coming up.
And just to say, I don't think we're further apart than a total disagreement. What I'm trying to suggest is that platforms aren't the only thing that we should be thinking about here when we think about building a different way of thinking of the internet. And we don't want to insist on just regulation for platform companies that doesn't take into consideration that there are other ways to access information. And I agree with you that right now the scale problem is at the forefront of something that makes them unaccountable in so many ways. So Facebook said that they were going to hire 1,000 more content moderators, but that is not pegged to any kind of analytic of how many hours a day in content there actually is circulating through these networks. And so in order to get accountability, the question of the internal, right, auditing procedures, and then how that affects their business model. And then also, is there a possibility for external auditing? Right now, Honest Ads Act isn't going to get us there. I don't think there has to be a different way of thinking about the stitches between the platforms, right? It's not just this big five that we're dealing with. There's a lot at stake here for information flows, and it's coming up as a very American problem. In the hearings, they wanted, especially Google, Twitter, and Facebook, to say they were American companies, right? And what that means then is that we're also affecting the global flows of information. And that, to me, is I don't know if American legislation is the best way to think about a way forward.
And I'm afraid we're out of time, ladies and gentlemen. It's been an exhilarating and at times terrifying morning. And I know so much now more than I did 2.5 hours ago. So can I thank, well, first of all, thanks to all of you, and thanks to our speakers, to Joan, to Andie, to Peter in his absence, to Cathy, and to Matthew. Thank you all very much.